Ken Whyte, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Nice to be here, Stan.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm an avid reader of your Substack, Shush, right? Right,
Mhm.
that's what it's called, and also a big fan of this book that I have right here, Hoover. You have a new book coming out in a week or so, or 2 weeks,
That's right.
right? So we'll discuss that as well. But before we get into the podcast, can you give a brief overview of who you are, what you do, and how you came to write all these books?
Okay. Well, I'm a Canadian journalist of long standing. I started out as a sports writer, moved to politics, and moved from reporting to editing. I was editor of a magazine called Saturday Night, which was Canadian equivalent of, say, something like Atlantic Monthly in the 90s. And then we launched a national newspaper in Canada called the National Post. I was the founding editor of that. And then sometime later, I was editor and publisher of a weekly news magazine called Maclean's. And I did that for about 5 years, then ran a magazine company of about 45, 50 different magazines. And now I have my own little publishing company that is my retirement project. I don't golf, so I decided I'd publish books instead. And we just started 2 or 3 years ago. It's called Sutherland House, and that is where the Shush newsletter comes from. And I've been I signed my first book contract when I was in my 20s, and I never finished it because I kept getting these great editing jobs. But the first book I wrote was about William Randolph Hearst. It was called The Uncrowned King, the sensational rise of William Randolph Hearst. That came out in about 2008. Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times came out about 3 or 4 years ago. And my latest is called The Sack of Detroit, General Motors and the End of American Enterprise, and it comes out in about a week. And writing books is something I'd always wanted to do, but it's a precarious way to make a living, and I kept getting all these great jobs in publishing, so they took precedent. But now that I've reached a stage in life where I can be choosier about what I do and how I spend my time, really, I don't want to do anything but make and write books.
Yeah, so maybe before we get into the details of your books, when did you first fall in love with books and with reading?
Um, It was sort of a slow thing. My mother used to take me to the public library when I was a kid, and I did enjoy reading, but only in a casual way. And I read well for my age, but it wasn't like I was reading adult books at age 9 or anything like that. It wasn't exceptional in any way. I just enjoyed it. And when I was in high school, I started going to the library on my own to find books to read, and started university as a science major. Um, I was totally unprepared for university. I didn't know what anyone studied for. There were only sort of two career paths that I'd even heard about. One was being a lawyer and one was being a doctor. And my brother was going to be a lawyer, so I figured that I had to go to there. And it was not a great experience. But I had to take a mandatory English lit class, like all undergrads did at that time. And I really enjoyed it. And I actually met a couple of kids who were majoring in English, and that sounded like just a wild thing to do. So I switched into the English department, eventually switched to the history department. I was all over the place, never finished anything, never finished a degree, but really got serious about my reading during that time. And it, all through my career in journalism, reading really fed everything I did.
Mm-hmm. And was journalism like a natural path based on your love for reading in college? Did you just feel like, being a doctor and a lawyer wasn't the route I want to go down? So here's this other profession, maybe I'll go down there.
It had never occurred to me to be a journalist. And it was during one of the periods when I dropped out of university again, and I was working as a janitor on a night shift from 4 p.m. till 11:30 p.m. And I'd done that for about 2.5 months. It was an okay job because I could finish my work in 2 hours and then listen to hockey games or read for the rest of the night. But I began to get bored after a couple of months, and I looked in the want ads and I saw a job opening for a sports reporter at a tiny suburban newspaper, and it just seemed like so much more fun than what I was doing. So as soon as I got off shift, I drove out to the suburb of Edmonton where I grew up and found this little newspaper, and I just waited outside all night until somebody came in the morning, and I was the first one in to apply. And through various exaggerations of my college newspaper experience, I think I'd done exactly one story for the university newspaper. I managed to talk myself into that job, and I just loved every minute of being a journalist. Never wanted to go home, never wanted to do anything else. But it was a surprise. My father says that growing up, The Odd Couple, Oscar Madison was my role model in life, so he wasn't surprised at all. But I was surprised to end up in journalism as a sports reporter. And then once I got in, sports was the entry. But I was interested in everything. I wrote about politics, I wrote about crime, I wrote about books and the arts, and as well as sports. And the great thing about journalism is it can take you just about anywhere you want to go. It's an excuse to be interested in anything that you find interesting, as long as you can communicate that interest to other people. And that, to me, was always a great luxury, to be able to, find what was interesting to you, as long as you could make it interesting to somebody else. You had permission to spend your time on it, and that's one of the things I love most about it. Plus, just being in a newsroom with a whole bunch of people who were sort of like-minded and curious about everything that was going on, and a little bit cynical about everything that was going on, and just talking all through the day about what was happening locally, what was happening in the world, and having an excuse to pay attention to whatever was most interesting in the world on a given day, and not having to be narrowly disciplined and focused on some, really important thing about particle physics or financial instruments or some point of law. You could just follow whatever was interesting. It's a great thing to do.
Yeah, and what led you to drop out of college? Did I get
a terrible student?
Is it for lack of caring, or is it just you just didn't?
My lack of discipline. I was interested in a lot of the subjects, but when I'd get interested in the subject, I just want to concentrate on that thing. So if we're reading one author in a course, and say, Hemingway or something, as a survey course of American literature, and I liked Hemingway, I just keep reading Hemingway, and I would not read the rest of whatever had been assigned. And, that doesn't help your grades at all. And same with history. I like going down rabbit holes when I found a period or a subject that really interested me. And I didn't ever want to stick to a disciplined form of inquiry, which was, again, I think why I made a better journalist than I did an academic.
Yeah. Obviously you spent a good chunk of your career as a journalist. Where do you see the future of journalism going, especially considering that there are, these Substacks, a lot of very prominent former, writers for the New York Times or just public intellectuals start these Substacks, and they could support themselves and people support them. Do you see the future of journalism going more in that direction, or attempting to revive existing institutions, like the New York Times or, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera?
I wish I could tell you where it was going, but I actually don't have a clue. The most of the legacy media is going to die. Most of the metro papers that we all grew up with are going to die. Some of them look like they'll be okay. The ones especially that can attract an international audience, which is, I think, why the Times of London, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times are all going to do reasonably well into the future. It looks like there'll be a product there and a market for it. But for a lot of other advertising-driven media, whether it's newspapers, magazines, or conventional television, it's going to be difficult going forward. I don't really see Substack as the answer generally for journalism. I think some people will do well on it. Some people who have really good followings and who are really productive and dedicated and can churn it out every 2 days or 4 days or once a week and provide people with something they're willing to pay for. Those people will do well, but those people are very, very few and far between. And even then, if they do well, I think that somebody is going to figure out a way, again, to consolidate a lot of the activity on in newsletters. Media generally tends towards consolidation, and it deplores atomization, both from the point of view of advertisers and from the point of view of consumers. Nobody wants to have to go out and find 40 or 50 different newsletters and subscribe to them separately to find out what's going on in the world and on all of the things that they're interested in. I think somebody at some point will find a way to bring a lot of voices together again into a product that people will pay for. And that may be then, it may not be that their products are as general as your daily newspaper was that covered everything from local news to national news to international news to sports to arts to food and style. I don't know that we'll see all that in one place anymore, but something like The Athletic, if it works, could be a model. Somebody may do something similar on the art scene. Politico, I think, has a good model for national political news. So, there's a lot of interesting things going on out there, and I'm confident about the future of news. I think there always will be good practitioners out there, and I believe they will figure out a way to get paid, and somebody will figure out a way to consolidate a lot of these great voices into some sort of project, but some sort of product, but I don't know yet myself. I don't have a good sense of what that is.
Yeah, and one of the one of the things you've managed to do, you call it your retirement project, but It's as a 24-year-old now, it's kind of a dream down the line to have something similar. But the concern is always the future of publishing. Is it profitable? And it seems from the outside looking in that it's less and less profitable, because it seems like fewer and fewer people are buying books, even though there are more and more books available and they're cheaper than ever and more accessible than ever. You can get anything in in 24 hours. So what made you want to start a publishing company?
Well, before I get to that, I want to deal with the fact that you're 24 years old, because I was not much older than you, maybe a few years older when I came up with the idea of doing this. Because I met a guy when I was in my late 20s, named Ed McNally, who just retired from being an oil man in Alberta, which is the part of Canada that I'm from. And he was hanging around at a lot of political conventions because he had political interests and he donated money to parties and so on. But I asked him, what he was spending his time on, and he said to me, well, I have to work, otherwise I'll drive my wife crazy. And like, he didn't golf either. So he said, he needed something to do. So he thought, what is there in, life that I now that I can spend my time doing whatever I want, what would I spend that time on? And he said, well, what am I passionate about? I guess I'm passionate about beer. So I guess I'll start a brewery. And back then, this was in, late 80s, early 90s. Now everybody does craft breweries. Nobody was doing craft breweries. And there was like 2 big brewers in US and 2 big brewers in Canada, and that was it. But Ed went out and hired a brewmaster from Germany and started a craft brewery, which is now about the biggest in Canada. And that's how he spent his retirement. And I thought that was such a cool thing to do that I always tucked it away in the back of my mind, and knew that when I got to that age, I was going to do something like that. Because what else are you going to do, when you're finished with whatever was your first career in life? So keep that in mind, Stanley. It might come in handy someday, way down the road for you. As far as book publishing goes, look, I came out of magazines and newspapers, both of which were devastated by the rise of the internet and it's sucking away all of the advertising that had sustained newspapers and magazines for generations. My last years in the magazine business, we were looking at a 10% decline in revenue every year. So it just meant cutting and more cutting and downsizing and rethinking, year after year after year. That gets kind of depressing after a while. People say that there's not a lot of growth in the book business, and it's true, there's not. If you look over the last decade, total revenues go up maybe 2-3% a year on average, although it's been better in the pandemic. But it's a low growth business. The fact that it has any growth seems just like nirvana to me, coming out of newspapers and magazines. Christ, that's a challenged market. This, slow growth environment is something I can live with. You're absolutely right about all of the books that are produced every year, and that's a huge challenge. Pretty much anyone can publish a book now, and I can't remember what the number is, something like 700,000 books a year in the US published every year. So it's getting really crowded out there, really crowded on Amazon, and it's a challenge to get your books noticed. That's the biggest challenge in publishing right now, is how do you get a book discovered when each book has 700,000 competitors on release. So it's got challenges, the book industry, but if you've got a good property, if you got a good book, and you got an author who's willing to work to get it out there, and a publisher who's committed to promoting it, it's possible.
Okay. Well, I'll keep that in mind. So maybe I'll start a publishing company one day.
I'll be watching. Mhm.
Okay, so I want to talk about your book. Obviously, I haven't had a chance, in full transparency, to read your new book, your most recent book about Detroit, the sack of Detroit.
Not
Um,
out this week, so you're forgetting.
yeah, but this book is awesome. It's I didn't think I'd like Herbert Hoover as much as I did, and he's one of those presidents that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about because we're taught that his only story was I think 5 months into his presidency, the Depression hits. He didn't really do much, and that's his presidency. And I don't. And obviously, you have a completely different take because there's no way what I just said would fill 500 pages. But why did you decide to write about Herbert Hoover?
Well, it took me some convincing to write about Hoover. I started out exactly where you started out. Why would anyone want to write about a failed president and one that had a reputation as not a particularly interesting character? So I resisted that. What I actually wanted to do is, after I'd written about Hearst, all of which that book all took place in the late 19th century. And I enjoyed that period of time so much, I thought I'd just move up another 25 years or so and do something in the early 20th century and just keep learning my way through the 20th century. That was kind of the plan. And I read a lot about World War One. And Hoover kept popping up in the literature of World War One because he was in London at the time. He was a mining engineer based in London, and he'd helped feed the Belgians after they were occupied by the Germans during World War One. Helped feed a nation of 8 million people for the duration of the war, and is generally credited with having saved 8 million people from starvation. And then he was with Wilson at the peace talks in 1919 at the end of the war. And again, he was popping up everywhere. People were saying, if you want to get anything done in Europe now that the war's over and the island or the continent's all been blown to shit after 5-6 years of fighting. If you want to get anything done, go to Hoover. He's the only one who can accomplish anything at this time. And he was viewed as this incredibly competent and trustworthy and reliable individual who had almost superhuman powers when it came to getting anything done. And just the fact that he had personally started the Belgian relief and carried out the Belgian relief, and then again saved millions more lives in the months after the war by distributing food and other necessaries. I thought that was just a great thing to have done, regardless of his political career. So I wanted to write about Hoover's war and just tell that story, and then at the end of the book have him go off into politics to ruin his life. But I couldn't sell that story. Nobody would publish it. They all kept saying, you got to do the whole biography, you got to do the whole life. There hasn't been a good life of Hoover, and people prefer biographies, sort of cradle to grave stories about American presidents rather than these smaller vignettes of their life. So I went back and started reading more about Hoover, learned more about his upbringing, the fact that he was born really on the frontier to a Quaker family. He was orphaned by the age of 8 or 9, passed around his family, had a really rough upbringing that he hid in later years, but had a really rough time as an adolescent. Was first student ever to arrive at Stanford University in its inaugural year. Had an amazing career as a mining engineer. He was your age and he was running gold mines in Australia. And a few more years, he was running China's coal mines and digging for gold there as well. He was there during the Boxer Rebellion, given up for dead, managed to escape, go back to London where he made a fortune and was really worth a huge amount of money before the First World War, lost a lot when the war outbroke, but didn't really care and gave himself over to humanitarian work anyway. Then he starts his political career, and the more I looked into that, the more substantive he seemed to me. He was a really accomplished commerce secretary for Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s, and pretty much anything of interest that happened in those administrations during the 1920s was accomplished by Hoover, generally with the support, but not always with the support of his presidents. And then we got to the Hoover's own administration between 28 and 32. And of course, as you say, the Depression starts really 5 months into his term, and he didn't get a chance to do any of the things that he wanted to do. He had a very progressive-minded Republican and had a lot of social reforms that he wanted to bring in, but never had the chance because he was dealing with an economic calamity almost from the get-go. And the more I looked at that, the more I saw that the record on it was didn't do him justice, that he had fought far more diligently and imaginatively against the Depression than he was given credit for. Some historians have recognized just everything he tried to do, and the fact that a lot of the New Deal was actually based on things that Hoover had tried while he was, or was setting up while he was president. But he came much closer than people would suspect to actually righting the ship in the Depression. Failed ultimately to stop it in its tracks, but again, did much better than people would think. His biggest failure was as a politician. He didn't take politics seriously, wasn't a great communicator, didn't think enough about how to engage his audience, his base. He was more concerned with actually getting the job done and trying to fix the problems of America, and he let a lot of his political duties slide. And of course, he comes up against Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, who was probably the most gifted politician that America had ever had. And Roosevelt made mincemeat of Hoover during the election of 32. But then Hoover comes back and founds the opposition to New Deal democratic politics, and was really the founder of the new Republican Party, which was he would have identified as a party in opposition to New Deal politics. And for 30 years, he was very influential in that. So you got a guy who starts out as an orphan on the Iowa frontier, and he ends his life at the age of 90, still all together there, and still fishing he was a very serious fisherman up to a year or two before he died. And he lived his last days in the Waldorf Towers in New York with the Duke of Windsor and Cole Porter as neighbors. Just the arc of that life to me was incredible. The more I looked at it, you could tell really the whole story of the first half of the 20th century through Hoover. Sometimes he was the hero, sometimes he was an opponent of the heroes, but he was always in the mix. He always had something to say. He always represented some important part of the American public. And he was, at a personal level, I don't think he was actually, I don't know that I found him likable, but I found him fascinating and admirable in that he always, especially when he went into public life, he was determined to do good and to be as honest as he could. And he ran a very clean administration. And he was a principled politician. He rarely stooped to low blows and negative attacks on his opponents. Generally took the high road, and on the whole, I think, was a really admirable public servant.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in his life. One of the things that's very obvious is the comparison you can make between Hoover and Donald Trump, for example, because they're both businessmen, and both of them did not have a lot of success, negotiating with Congress, because they're used to a certain kind of way of life where it's my way or the highway, and that's I think both to the detriment of both men and both presidents. The other part, when I was reading the book, he reminded me of another president that because of his service to the country, and that's John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, not not as well known historically as his father, but served in the Senate and the House before his presidency, was an ambassador to 3 countries, then becomes president, serves his time as president, then goes back to the Senate and actually dies in his Senate seat, which is almost a romantic kind of American story. But Hoover reminded me of that kind of spirit of service to his country, and how much he cared about every single role he took on. And I think that stems from the beginning of your book, which is his Quaker upbringing. And he grew up in a place where people didn't have much, but everything they had, they would, share, they would help out their fellow neighbor. And it was very, very kind of, Christian values were heavily instilled in him. And that took him throughout his whole life. So the interesting thing is, he goes from Iowa, where he was born, and then he's orphaned at 9 years old, as you mentioned, and he moves to Oregon, correct, to live with his, I forget who it is, but it's a doctor, uncle. There you go. And there he falls in love with business, right, and tries to make the buck. How does that transition occur, and how does that influence the rest of his life?
Yeah, just on John Quincy Adams, I think you're right about that. And another area that they have similarities is they're probably the 2 most cosmopolitan presidents America has ever had. Quincy Adams spent a lot of his life outside of the United States. So did Hoover, from the age of about 21 or 22 until he was uh, about 40. He'd lived overseas, and so he had both of them learned a lot from politics overseas, and were far more influenced by things going on in Europe in important ways than they were things going on in America. So yeah, I think that's a really appropriate comparison. As far as the business goes, that was, I think, sort of a refuge for Hoover as an adolescent. His uncle was a doctor, but his uncle was also one of a number of young professionals who were trying to put Salem, Oregon on the map, and had real estate development interests and public transportation interests and different things. And Hoover started as their office boy. And I think having that personal responsibility and something that he could oversee and own himself and do to the best of his abilities and do it right and prove his worth, I think really meant a great deal to him. And people who remember him from that time say that he was the most efficient and most competent person they'd ever seen in any office anywhere. At the age of 14 or 15, he was pretty much running the day-to-day operations of this vast company for his uncle and his uncle's partners. So he took to business immediately, and he had that kind of very practical and retentive mind that served you well in business. And he knew his own interests really well. He knew what made money, what didn't make money, and that the whole point of the exercise was to make money. And he was, as far as anyone who ever employed him, considered him to be an incredibly valued employee. And those skills that he developed served him when he went into business on his own. And again, if he had stuck to that route, we could very well know him today, not as a failed politician, but as a Vanderbilt or a Getty, or one of these figures in American history, people who just made a ton of money and colonized a whole part of the economy. I think he certainly had that in him, but it wasn't really where his heart lay. He wanted to go out and as you say, make a difference in the world by serving people rather than by amassing wealth. And that was definitely something that comes from the Quaker background, from his parents. He came from a long line of Quaker ministers, and it was drilled into him at a fairly early age that public service was how you made a worthwhile contribution to humanity, and how you lived a good life. Getting rich was nice, but it was not an end in itself.
Right. A lot of what people know about him, I think, is, in my opinion, and I think backed up by your book, is a case of history being written by the victors in some ways. So FDR wins the election, as you mentioned, trounces Hoover, becomes president. And going forward, we have a bunch of historians, I think like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a bunch of these kind of historians that write almost a New Deal kind of history. And obviously, after his presidency, we have the mention, the Hoovervilles and all of these things that deeply affected Hoover, I think, after his presidency, and it took him a while to recover from that because he definitely took it personally. What was his relationship with FDR like um, before and after the election? And this is a two-part question. So he also critiqued. He spent a good chunk of his post-presidential life critiquing the New Deal. Was that more of a personal attack on FDR, or is it political because it was partially based on his ideas that he never got to implement?
Um, both good questions. You know, the relationship between the two of them is kind of fascinating in its own right. It starts in the 1920s when Hoover has not yet committed to a political party in 1919, 1920. Going into that election, Hoover was seen as a potential candidate for either the Democrats or the Republicans. And there were people within the Democratic Party suggesting a ticket of Herbert Hoover with Franklin Roosevelt as his vice president. And so they had dinner regularly. They got along. Hoover thought they were friends, and I think if you look at the correspondence between them, Roosevelt treated him as a friend too. But when it came time for political battle in 1932, Roosevelt's just absolutely ruthless as a politician. He knows what his job is, and he isn't going to let any friendships or past acquaintance get in the way of doing what's necessary to win an election. And so he went after Hoover, hammer and tong, attacked him from the left, attacked him from the right, attacked him for ideas that he stole from Hoover later. And Hoover was completely baffled by this behavior because it was, as I said, he wasn't really a politician, and he didn't believe in doing things that were just politically expedient and in order to win a contest, and as a result, he got killed. And afterwards, Hoover took a long time to heal from that defeat. He never warmed to Roosevelt again. He thought Roosevelt treated him very poorly as a former president, didn't seek his counsel on anything, didn't give him anything useful to do, even though Hoover still wanted to serve. And Hoover, seeing as how things were going, began attacking Roosevelt's policies, not him personally, but his policies, and did so consistently all through the Roosevelt years. And I think it was both on principle. He genuinely disagreed with a lot of things that Roosevelt was doing, most things that Roosevelt was doing. But there was also a definite undercurrent of animosity towards Roosevelt for what he judged to be mistreatment that he suffered at the hands of Roosevelt. And so he not only fought him all the way through the Depression on economic policies, but when World War II started to blow up, Hoover was a leader of the anti-war forces and very much wanted America to stay out of the war, believed that Roosevelt was provoking Japan and trying to back America into the war. And right up until Pearl Harbor, Hoover continued that opposition and had to essentially sit on the sidelines through the war. It wasn't until Roosevelt died and Harry Truman came to office that Hoover felt at all welcome in Washington again.
Yeah. Again, another maybe misconception that we have about Hoover is that he did not do enough to help prevent the economic downturn or do enough in terms of government programs or obviously you outline in your book that he created more federal jobs and there are numerous things and actions he took um, and in my mind this is one of those I spoke recently to a writer on economics named Nicholas Wapshott, and he wrote a book called Keynes Hayek about 10 years ago. And this seems to me a very Keynesian versus Hayek kind of fight. But um, so with, for example, with Hayek, it would be, there should be no government action. But Nicholas Wapshott had a good line. He said, well, there are no, I feel like everyone is a Keynesian in the well, when push comes to shove, they're always going to be Keynesians, and that's indicative of George Bush in 2008, and I think with Hoover during the beginning of the Great Depression, because maybe he didn't want to take as much government action, he didn't believe in it, but he felt like he had to do something. So, do we completely misunderstand his role in trying to uh, do something during the Depression?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. You know, it Hoover was as progressive as Republicans got in the 1920s, and when there was a depression, brief one in 1921, it was Hoover that convinced Warren Harding that the federal government actually had a role to play during a depression, and that it could introduce countercyclical policies and stimulate the economy when the economy was in a down cycle. So, you know, he was way ahead of his time on that, and it was controversial at the time, but Harding let Hoover push it through. Harding really admired Hoover. So, you know, that was probably the last time in American life where an administration had a choice to sit on the sidelines when the economy turn down and do nothing. And because after you've done it once, as Hoover did in 21, after you've said, well, you know, we can introduce countercyclical policies. We have a responsibility to do everything in our power to turn the economy around. There's no going back from that. You can't just say next time, no, we're just going to let people suffer and we're just going to wait this out. You have to do what you can. And that begins with Hoover. And in the 30s, he, out of necessity, he was right from the very start far more active than any other president had been in fighting the downturn. He was getting credit from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and everybody else for just how vigorous he was in his response to the stock market crash. And that generally is something that people don't know these days. And as the Depression got deeper, he kept doing more and more and more out of necessity and went further than I think he ever dreamed he would go in involving the federal government in an economic downturn. At the time, there was a firm view in America that relief of people affected by economic downturns was a local responsibility, that it was something that started at the community level, something that municipal bodies did, community chests, and local relief were seen as the answers to people in distress. It was neighbors looking after neighbors, and nobody saw a need, or few people saw a need for the federal government to give direct relief payments to victims of the Depression. It's one thing to do counter-cyclical policies. It's another to start using the federal treasury to essentially bail out victims of the Depression. And very few people wanted that done in the 1930s. There was a sense among the nation's mayors and governors that it was insulting to them to say that the federal government had to step in, because it implied that mayors and governments and governors and community leaders weren't doing their job or weren't up to the job. And they looked at it as federal overreach, as federal meddling in their areas of jurisdiction. So there was just not a lot of appetite for direct relief. And even when Roosevelt did finally bring it in himself, he always did it as a very temporary measure, and he only did it after about 4 or 5 years of depression, when it was clear that this wasn't an ordinary downturn. So Hoover didn't go as far as Roosevelt did, and wasn't as complete a Keynesian as we would now consider Keynesians to be. But Keynes was one of Hoover's great cheerleaders during Hoover's administration, thought Hoover was making a lot of great moves. So he was, it was a much more complicated situation, and his involvement was much more nuanced than people generally understand.
Yeah, and maybe to wrap up with the Hoover talk, what was his life like after his presidency? Obviously, we discussed the fact that it took a deep toll on him. The loss and the criticism, and the fact that there was a depression and Roosevelt's attacks, but he eventually bounced back. And as you mentioned, I think he was the oldest living president until Carter, and then George H.W. Bush. He died at 90 years old. What did he do with the rest of his life?
After what would he have been? Maybe in his 70s, when Truman came to power, and Truman involved Hoover in public life again in a number of ways, starting with sending him to Europe to help in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, help with the food distribution and rebuilding efforts in Germany. Hoover was kind of a one-man Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan. And then Hoover also gave, the government had been enormously expanded in its scale and responsibilities during the Second World War. It had colonized huge parts of the American economy. The auto industry had become an arms producer, and the whole food and other and dry goods industries had been put on a wartime footing, and that all had to be unwound after the war. And Truman saw a need to look at the whole of government, and to right-size the federal government, and figure out which of its new agencies and new administrations would stay, how should things be organized. It was an incredibly important assignment, and he gave it to Hoover, and it was continued under Eisenhower. And so Hoover had a hand in fact, the lead hand in deciding how American government would be organized in a post-war world. And that was one of his greatest achievements, and one of the things that he found, I think, very rewarding in his post-presidential career. So he did that. He wrote a lot of books. about 6 volumes of memoir, published 5 or 6 volumes of speeches, wrote a really good book about Woodrow Wilson in Paris, and he caught a lot of fish, just a ton of fish. He would go fishing and fish from 6 in the morning till 6 at night for 14 days straight, and hardly said a word the whole time, but caught a lot of fish and had a great time. So those are the kinds of things that he liked to do.
Right. And obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, you have a new book coming out June 1st, which I think is 2 weeks from now, called The Sack of Detroit, General Motors and the End of American Enterprise. Different than the book about Hoover. I mentioned before that I haven't had a chance to read it. Obviously, it's because it's not out yet. Obviously, I'm looking forward to reading it after reading your book on Hoover. So can you tell the audience what the book is about, what inspired you to write it, and why they should read it? Why it should be considered an important book?
Yeah, well, something really important happened to American business in the 1960s, something that I was trying to get a grip on through this book, and that in the 1950s and early 60s, through the Cold War years, there was a lot of attention given to economic growth. In fact, there was probably no bigger priority in American public life than economic growth. When all through the Eisenhower years, and even when Kennedy became the president in 1960, his biggest goal in life was, as president, was to grow the economy at 5% a year. Everybody was worried about the Russians, how fast the Russians were growing. Much like we looked at China now, they looked to Russia then. And it was thought that if America didn't grow at 5% a year, that it was going to lose the race, and the world would end up being in the domain of communist Russia rather than a liberal capitalist state like America. So that was how the decade started. But by the end of it, that set of priorities had pretty much gone out the window. And I wanted to see kind of at that macro level what had happened, why it had happened, and what the consequences were. And I was particularly interested in what happened with American business, because in the 1960s, when that priority was taken off of growing the economy, American business stopped growing at the same rate that it had historically. And in fact, if you look at the 70, 80 years before 1963, 64, the economic growth was probably about 30 to 35% higher than it has been since 1960 through 1964. So the dynamism went out of the American economy at that time. So I looked at General Motors, because General Motors, for all intents and purposes, was the American economy in the 1960s. 1 in 6 jobs, 1 in 5 consumer dollars was spent on automobiles, and General Motors was half the automobile market. It was just enormous in a way that we can't really comprehend now. You'd have to take Google and Amazon and Facebook and put them together to get something comparable in terms of its economic importance. And but it was going great, General Motors, all through the mid 60s until it got attacked on issues of automobile safety. These issues were led by Ralph Nader, but also included the tort industry in America and a lot of people in government. Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Labor Department, Bobby Kennedy, a senator, Abraham Ribicoff, a senator. And they were motivated by a desire to put business in its place. They were all liberal Democrats, and they believed that America had spent too much time thinking about economic growth in the 50s and early 60s, and that it was time to to change America's priorities and to make people understand that the federal government was where they should look for progress and amelioration in American life, not to the business sector. Business had to be subordinated to government, which could bring people better schools, better cities, better healthcare, and so on. And so let's subordinate business to government. And the way that they sought to do this was by putting General Motors first and foremost in its place. They attacked it on the issue of auto safety and essentially blamed General Motors for killing 40,000 people a year on American highways by building unsafe cars. And by the end of by the end of 1966, they had brought the whole of Detroit under federal regulation for the first time in its history. General Motors brand was severely damaged by these accusations that it was producing murderous vehicles, lethal vehicles as they were called, and its finances deteriorated seriously. Its share price fell by 35 to 40% and would take almost 40 years to recover. And General Motors itself never really recovered from that experience. So I spent a lot of time looking at just what happened in this safety crisis, which turned out to be pretty much an invented crisis. In fact, the cause of safety was set back seriously by Nader and his pals, who were blaming Detroit for what was, a definite tragedy in that 40,000 people a year were dying on American roads. But the real trick to fixing that problem was to get drivers to sober up and drivers to be less reckless and wear their seatbelts. The drunk driving laws and sobriety legislation, as well as mandatory seatbelt laws, were what really improved traffic safety around the world. But Nader and his gang were so determined to blame Detroit for what was going on in the roads, because they were involved in this larger project of subordinating business to government and reducing the influence of business in American life. They were so determined to blame General Motors that they actively opposed efforts to make people wear seatbelts or to drive sober. And America went from #1 in the world in auto safety to number 18 or 20 today. And General Motors, as we know, has never really been the same since the mid-60s. Generally, it's thought that it was the '74 oil crisis that caught GM flat-footed. But if you look at their finances, and I found a lot of things that weren't on the public record about their internal finances and internal consumer surveys and so on. And it was really in 1966, at the time of the safety crisis, that everything fell apart. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question about what the book's about.
And is it called The Sack of Detroit because of the amount of jobs that were lost and the fact that Detroit is still hasn't recovered from the immense loss. I think General Motors and all these car companies in Detroit employed hundreds of thousands of people, and um, that's a lot of people with a lot of kind of middle class to lower middle class jobs. That
Oh, yeah. 600,000 people employed in the auto industry. Well, at General Motors alone back then, and when America had a lot fewer people. It's called the Sack of Detroit because this coalition of public interest advocates and political activists and court lawyers all decided at the same time that they were going to go after Detroit and its prestige and its finances and its power and influence in American life and get some of that for themselves. And they succeeded very well.
wow. Okay, so to wrap up the podcast, I always ask the same questions of every guest, and that's I'm going to put them together, answer in whatever order you prefer. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future, and that could be as general or as targeted as you prefer. And the second one is, what are 5 books that you would recommend to anyone, fiction or nonfiction? They don't have to be your 5 favorite books. It's just, here, read these 5 books. They're great, and you know.
Oh boy, what gives me hope for the future? Um, Stanley, you give me hope for the future. The fact that there's still young people out there who are interested in ideas and who are reading books and interested in books, and you know, I do. You hear so many things about social media and Twitter and short attention spans and everything, but I have met a lot of young people like yourself who do read, who are committed to literature and ideas, and that always gives me hope that you know, we're still more or less on the right track as a society. In terms of 5 books to read,
It can be more than 5 if it's too hard.
oh no, it'll be hard. I just read again, and I read it about every decade. Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, because it's still not only a great book, a great novel, a great story in its own right, but it's probably one of the most interesting and smartest book about politics that I've ever read. I'm in the middle of Kingsley Amos's memoirs, and they are a riot. He is offensive and wrong about a million things, but he's genuinely brilliant and entertaining. And so I'm having a lot of fun with them. I recently finished Andrew Roberts' Napoleon the Great. If you want just a masterful biography to read this summer, I would give that one a try. Let's see. There's a book called Kiss Yourself Goodbye, and it's going to take me a minute. Kiss Myself Goodbye. Yes, and it's by Ferdinand Mount, who's a Brit journalist who has written a memoir about his aunt Munka to try and figure out just what happened in her life. He was fairly close to her, but only so close that he knew that nothing about her added up, and that he had to get to the bottom of her life. So he spends a few years trying to track down absolutely everything he can about her, and it was really worth the effort because she's a one-of-a-kind character, and it's a really entertaining, well-written book. Kiss Myself Goodbye: The Many Lives of Aunt Munka. And then I will mention a new Sutherland House book that we've got out. Just came out last week. It's a biography of Norman Jewison, who's a film director. He happens to be Canadian and was born in Toronto, where I now live, but spent his whole career in Hollywood. And he directed a whole bunch of movies, classic movies that you'd know, starting with In the Heat of the Night through Jesus Christ Superstar, Moonstruck with Cher and Nicolas Cage, the Thomas Crown Affair with Steve McQueen, and a whole bunch of other really great movies. But what's really fascinating about the book is the writer Ira Wells got access to Jewison's enormous archive, and so he's able to reconstruct in a really concrete way just what it is that a director does in the course of his career, and what goes into making a movie, how difficult it is to make a transition from one era of movie making to another, and so on. So it's a really good book about what directors do and how they work. It's called Norman Jewison, A Director's Life. So those are my 5.
Awesome. Your book that I'm going to show one more time right here, Hoover, is phenomenal. I'm looking forward to your new book, The Sack of Detroit. For any book lovers or just, fans of good writing, I'd recommend your Substack, Shush. So, Ken Whyte, I appreciate you coming onto the podcast and speaking with me.
It was a real pleasure, Stanley. Good luck with it.
Thank
Thanks
you
again.